Hello, welcome to the Bitcoin Standard podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo, the president of the Mises Institute, a distinguished economist known for his uncompromising critiques of government overreach and central planning. He's a former professor at Loyola University in Maryland, longtime faculty member at the Mises Institute, and an author whose work challenges conventional narratives in economics, history, and politics. Professor DiLorenzo, thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have you.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so I guess there's a lot we could talk about from your work, and I've learned a lot from you over the years. Perhaps maybe we should take a chronological approach where we begin with your earlier work and then move on, and then we can talk about the Mises Institute and your current role in the Mises Institute and how you see the Mises Institute moving forward. Does that sound good?
Sure.
All right, so perhaps a good place to begin would be your work on U.S. history, particularly Lincoln.
Okay, we can start there. I'll give you a little different topic. Before that, what I was sort of known for is I did a lot of writing on antitrust regulation early in my career. Mm-hmm. And I published an article called The Origins of Antitrust in the International Review of Law and Economics that challenged the idea that there was a need for anti-monopoly laws in the U.S. in the late 19th century. And I found that that nobody at that time, in the 1980s, as of the 1980s, had actually looked at data on what was happening with the prices and production in the United States. At the time, the antitrust laws were invoked. This was the year 1890. And I found that the industries that were being accused of being monopolies had been dropping prices for the previous decade, and had been expanding production faster than GDP in general had been expanding, some of them 10 or 15 times faster. This was the Industrial Revolution, and these were the most dynamic, competitive industries in America, and they were targeted by their sour grapes competitors as monopolies, which they weren't. They were good competitors. And so that's one thing I was known for before the Lincoln stuff. And then I also challenged the whole idea of natural monopoly. That was a theory behind why all the public utilities in the U.S., water supply, electricity, telephone services, were all granted government monopolies. The theory goes that, well, if you allow the free market to work, economies of scale will appear, and they will create one big monopoly in all these industries, and we don't want that. So therefore, we need to create one big monopoly. And we benevolent politicians will set the prices. And so that happened all over America. But I showed in an article that was in the Review of Austrian Economics way back in the 80s also, that there was vigorous competition everywhere, electricity, telephone services, and everything else. And how it came about was basically a loot-sharing agreement between governments and corporations. In the city of Baltimore, for example, the very first public utility monopoly was created when the power company, the electric power company, today it's called Baltimore Gas and Electric, but this is turn of the 20th century. They said, we will give you, the state of Maryland, 15% of revenues every year if you give us a monopoly in the production of light. It was the light company. And that's how it came about. It came about through corruption, cronyism, and politics, and not the free market. And so that was sort of my background. And then I became sort of a Civil War buff. The American Civil War always fascinated me. What would motivate men to do the things that they did, and be in an army and march into a 50,000 man army with cannons and rifle pits, and for what? What motivated them to do that? And then in the course of that, I got to wondering, well, how can I combine my profession, economics, with this hobby of mine, Civil War history? And I started reading about Lincoln, and I started asking some of the Ivy League professors who were lecturing at the Smithsonian Institution at the time. I was taking a course, in Civil War history through the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and they recommended this one book called The Lincoln and the American Dream. And the economics was horrible. It said silly things like Lincoln was a lifelong protectionist because he wanted the average man to have a chance to become wealthy like he had become wealthy. It's just nonsense. And so that's how I got into writing articles about Lincoln.
The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by thesafehouse.com, my independent publisher and bookshop, selling the best Bitcoin books in high-quality cloth hardcovers built to last for generations. Most books these days are pretty fiat. They're flimsy and they fall apart quickly, and I did not want that for my books, so I set up the Safe House especially to provide you with beautiful, long-lasting classic cloth hardcovers you can proudly pass down for generations. You can get copies of my 3 books, The Bitcoin Standard, The Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics, and you can also get copies of Lynn Alden's Broken Money, Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly, and Matthew Lysiak's Fiat Food, to which I contributed a few chapters. We now offer bulk discounts so you can buy books for yourself and for the friends and family you'd like to learn about Bitcoin. Buy any 2 books for $50, any 5 books or more for $20 per book, and for more than 50 books, it's only $15 per book. Go to thesafehouse.com, the SAIF house.com, where you can get all of these books in high-quality cloth hardcovers, delivered worldwide, and get 10% off for paying with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by the Daylight Computer. I love to work early in the morning and late at night, or in the sun outdoors, but regular computer screens are terrible at these times, and they strain your eyes. For years, I've wanted a paper-like electronic screen on a simple computer I could use to write. I tried several models, but none were very good. Now, finally, Daylight have delivered a fantastic full-function tablet with a paper-like screen that's easy on your eyes and great for outdoor use. I've been using the Daylight computer to write my next book, and it is absolutely fantastic, and it has led me to invest in this company myself. Check out my interview with Anjan Kata in episode 249. Well, okay. Well, let's get back to the monopoly stuff, because that's another part of your work that I enjoy. I quoted that article you mentioned, the myth of natural monopoly. I quoted in my Principles of Economics book. I thought it was a great explanation of this. So the general idea here is that some industries are just naturally going to tend toward one producer, and therefore it's better to just have that producer be a monopoly that is protected from competition, that also has a monopoly on violence, because that somehow is going to make it a more efficient monopoly. Have I got this right?
Yes, basically, and it's all fairy tale, because even when I was in graduate school, long before I wrote this article, there was an economist named Walter Primo, it's spelled Primeaux, who wrote a whole series of articles. And I was thinking of writing my doctoral dissertation in this area because I was very interested in this at the time. And he showed that in America, there always were several dozen cities that did not do this, that allowed direct competition in the electric power industry, and not a profit sharing thing where the east side of the city is one company and the west side is the other. They all compete. They competed for everybody, for all the customers, and that was very, very telling to me. And he found that, sure enough, in a situation like that, you have lower prices and better services. And that's the exact opposite of what the so-called natural monopoly theory says. It says if you allow competition, it'll evolve into monopoly and bad service and monopoly pricing and all that. And on top of that, there's a literature in law and economics, quite a few articles published in the Journal of Law and Economics and elsewhere, showing that, of course, when you put the pricing of utilities like electricity in the hands of politicians, the price will be determined by politics. So it all depends on who has more political clout. If the corporation has more clout, then you're going to get higher prices. If there's a sort of a reaction to that by a segment of the public that is successful, well, then you'll get lower prices. And so even though we have this theory of natural monopoly, it always assumed that politicians would be like benevolent despots and always do what economists told them to do. But no, they do what's best for themselves politically, as all politicians do at all times.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the absurd things about this natural monopoly argument is usually it relies on some version of economies of scale, that in any particular town, it's inefficient to have 2 different power plants. It's more thermodynamically efficient to have one power plant. And so therefore, it's going to tend to be a monopoly. But of course, the reason this is absurd is that adherents of this theory apply it to every government, every city, every country, from cities with a few hundred people, isolated little cities with a few hundred people with one small generator, as well
Right.
as countries with 20 million people where they need to have one electric utility. And so the thermodynamics can't possibly justify one power plant at every single scale. There
Yeah.
has to be some benefits to scales, yes, of course. In thermodynamics, the bigger the power plant, the more efficient the conversion of heat to energy, because you get less heat loss, for instance, from thermal power plants. But there are also diseconomies of scale. There are ways in which scale can be counterproductive. After a certain scale, then long transmission lines lead to more losses. They become too expensive. It becomes more economic to have several generators. Even if they're less thermodynamically efficient, they're more economically efficient because of the costs of transmission. So the theory is clearly nonsensical, because it is entirely based on the idea that whatever scale, whatever political scale we're discussing, it's always best optimized by having one power generator.
Yeah. Well, of course, in today's world, smaller towns and cities can buy electricity from a lot of different sources, and that changes everything. And another basis of the theory is that these costs are fixed somehow. And so the government steps in and creates a monopoly. And what that usually does, it says no more competitive discovery is allowed. And it's competition. The Austrian economists say competition is a dynamic discovery process. And it is. And so who knows what kind of technology would have been discovered had the government not stepped in the early 20th century and created these monopolies everywhere and basically said, no more R&D, no more research and alternative ways of generating electricity and selling electricity. We know what is best for you. So it's just the same old sort of central planning mentality that a small group of people, advised by some wise economists, uh, very well paid wise economists, I would assume, as consultants to the state, would do that. That's sort of the fatal conceit, as Friedrich Hayek called it, about government planning.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I mean, whatever the merits of the argument on terms of scale, ultimately what they're saying is a monopoly that emerges naturally on the market is too dangerous, even though people have the option of just not buying their products, building their own alternative, going to some other alternative producer, extending power lines from another town. All these things are possible when you have a market monopoly, some bogeyman. But none of
Yes.
these things are possible when you have a government monopoly, because that government monopoly has a gun and it will shoot you if you object to it. They'll throw you in jail if you set up a competing power plant to the one that the
Yeah,
government.
even I, an academic, could make money with an ironclad monopoly enforced by violence. Yeah, who can't make a lot of money in that kind of situation? And of course, once any government program is established, it creates sort of a collection of special interests that profit from that program. The employees and the stockholders, and if there are stockholders, and so forth. And that creates a very difficult time in ever getting rid of it and deregulating. In the U.S., when we deregulated airlines, the Civil Aeronautics Board created basically a monopoly, a cartel situation for the airlines by making it illegal to cut prices. And there were more airlines in America, companies, in the 1930s than there were in the 1970s. And even big statists like Senator Ted Kennedy and Ralph Nader were in favor of deregulating the airlines because it was such an obvious monopoly scam. But it took, 40 years for that to happen, for the politics to finally realize that this was a bad deal for the vast majority of people. And the politicians turned around and deregulated airlines, partially anyway, but they're still under the boot of the Federal Aviation Administration. And in the U.S., the airports are almost all of them are run by state or local governments.
Yeah, and I think it's remarkable for me as somebody who travels a lot all over the world. it's remarkable for me that generally airlines in the US and airports in the US are fairly below global average. I mean, you travel around some of the Middle Eastern airlines and some of their airports, so much better organized, so much cleaner, so much more likely to be on time. A lot
Yeah.
less problems happen, and it's pretty startling, because the U.S. is not a cheap place. People have a lot
Yeah.
of income. You would expect that airplanes and airlines would do well, but what is it now with airlines? They go bankrupt roughly every 10 years or so, every 7 years, and then they get bailed out, and the airports rely on public money, and there's not a lot of competition here. Whereas with smaller countries, I think even though the airlines and airports are state run, they are small countries, so effectively they're competing on the global stage. So Qatar doesn't have, yeah, they have a
Yeah.
monopoly on airports in Qatar, but Qatar is a tiny
Yeah.
little island. So they're out there competing with all of the airlines of the world for running flights across the world. And so they have to get their act together. And so as a
Yeah.
result, it's a much better experience.
Yeah, that's how Japan broke into the highly protected American car industry in the 1960s and 70s. They were in bad shape economically after World War II, but they did it for sure. And a friend of mine that traveled to Bali, I think it was Singapore Airlines. He told me when they finally landed back home, he said, "Do I really have to get off the plane?" He didn't want to get off the plane. Yeah, it was so comfortable.
Yeah.
There's a
No,
vast
I
difference
agree.
from
The
the
difference in
American
airlines and airplanes
situation.
is quite startling. Okay, I want to discuss antitrust. So this is the prevailing idea that people have about this is that in the 19th century there were all these evil people called the robber barons, and these people controlled all of the industries of the US, all the major industries. They were in charge of the industrialization, and they all had monopolies. And it only was the genius guiding hand of the state that made them relinquish these monopolies, broke up their companies into smaller companies, allowed for competition, and and because of that, it increased the living standards of Americans and made these goods more and more affordable. Tell us why that's nonsense.
Well, you can study history. There's a little book by a man, Burton Folsom is the author's name. It's The Myth of the Robber Barons. And it's a straightforward history of the reality of these people. One good example is a man named James J. Hill, who was called a robber baron at the time. At the time, the government, after the American Civil War, very heavily subsidized two big transcontinental railroads that went from the American Midwest to California. And James J. Hill was an entrepreneur. He was a Canadian who came to America. He had one eye. His father died when he was 9, and he had to help his mother raise. I think he had 6 siblings, and he saved every penny as a young man working for various businesses, and he bought into a railroad company by the time he was older, and he eventually got investors to invest with him to create the Great Northern Railroad, a totally privately funded railroad that would compete with the government subsidized transcontinental railroads. He got no land grants from the American government like the other railroads did, free land. He would pay the American Indians for the rights of way through their property with cattle, whatever they could trade for. The government subsidized railroads, on the other hand, would call in the U.S. Army and shoot all the Indians and get them out of the way. And that was a way of socializing the cost of building the government subsidized railroads. But the bottom line is James J. Hill just outcompeted these other two, the Northern Pacific and the Central Pacific railroads, because he was a free market entrepreneur. And so therefore the government castigated him as an evil robber baron. They even later on, at the turn of this was all in the 1870s when this began, in the 1880s, the Great Northern Railroad. And by the 20 years later, one of the very first antitrust lawsuits in America sued James J. Hill's company. So the government had a grudge, a decades-long grudge against this man that made them look like damn fools with their crazy subsidies. And the government subsidized railroads were a huge mess. I used to talk about this to my college students, and I would write a map on the blackboard with a bunch of squiggly lines that looked like a bowl of spaghetti, and said, "Well, that's the railroad lines of the government subsidized railroads," because every member of Congress would say, "I'll vote for the subsidy, but you have to run a line to my small town of 500 people," and then I would put the actual on the internet from the internet on the screen. I put the actual routes of the government subsidized railroads, and it did look like a bowl of spaghetti. Whereas James J. Hill's was almost as straight a line as you can draw from the upper Midwest to the west coast of the United States through the Rocky Mountains, because it was all about efficiency and profitability to him. And that's the kind of thing that you read all throughout this book, The Myth of the Robber Barons. John D. Rockefeller became the richest man in the world by dropping the price of refined kerosene year after year after year for decades, and creating dozens of new products like Vaseline from the residue from his oil, from the petroleum. And although some of these people, the so-called robber barons, changed later on, they got involved in some of them, not James J. Hill, but some of them got involved in politics and did become sort of crony capitalists and not free market entrepreneurs. But that story is, in general, a phony story.
Yeah, I remember coming across this as well in Murray Rothbard's The Progressive Era, which is a great book, another great Rothbard book.
Yes.
And I found it pretty startling just how many examples he cites of this. I think he cites your book, or do you cite his? Can't remember which one was published first on
Yeah, I
this.
probably cited more of Murray Rothbard than he cited of me.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but The Progressive Era was one of his later works, so he may have
Oh
cited
yeah,
you in that one. Yeah.
yeah. That was actually a handwritten manuscript that my a Mises Institute fellow named Patrick Newman
Yes.
got all the handwritten manuscript and put it into a book, and the Mises Institute published it as a book.
Yes, we've had Patrick Newman on here. He's a friend of the show, and we're looking forward to having him on again. He's always interesting to chat with.
Yeah, he has a new book that we are going to publish in another couple of months called on Cronyism 2. He wrote a book on cronyism in American politics up until I think 1850, and this one is 1850 to a more modern
Yeah.
era.
What I found fascinating about this idea of the robber barons. So first of all, the discussion of this idea that they are ruthless monopolists exploiting the people is just economically illiterate. I mean, John D. Rockefeller in particular, you could lay a decent claim to say that he was the man who invented the modern world. He was the man who invented the industrial world of the 20th century
Yes.
by turning crude oil into these homogeneous products that were reliably delivered in standard. That was the whole point. Standard, standard containers, standard
Mhm.
shipment. Uh, he standardized the entire process of getting energy to people and completely transformed people's lives by giving people cheap kerosene and then cheaper gasoline and so on. It was truly, truly one of the most impactful actions anybody has done. He was really one of the greatest humans to ever live, in my mind, because he managed this company as it went from just one small Ohio oil producer to the global leader in the industry of oil. And it's improved the lives of billions of people all over the world, and it continues to do so until today. And he did all of that while the price of his product was declining. Every year almost, kerosene was getting cheaper. All of his products continued to get cheaper because he used the fact that he managed the companies really well. He used economies of scale, and he negotiated great deals with the railroads and so on. And all of that led to him providing people with a lot of cheap kerosene and a lot of cheap products. And that's why everybody used his products. So the idea that he was out there exploiting people is ridiculous because all the alternatives were offering people much more expensive kerosene. And
True.
it's ridiculous to present this as evil. And I recently read a book by Walter Isaacson, I think it was, who wrote a biography of Rockefeller called Titan. And I found it amazing how some 21st century journalist or late 20th century journalist is just so critical of so much of Rockefeller's life and completely without any, any reason to do so. I mean, you're
Yeah.
just a writer who's writing about the guy who's created the 20th century. And he's just constantly passing judgment on how he acted. And I found it truly, I think, one of the worst manifestations of the anti-capitalist sentiment that you see growing in the 20th century in the US. And I think this vilification of the robber barons, presenting them as if they're evil people, was a monumental shift in the perception of free enterprise and capitalism in the US, perhaps. In that, after this, everybody started, well, not everybody, but increasingly people began to see that if you're a rich businessman, then you must have done it by exploiting people, by taking advantage of
Yeah.
people. And they missed the fact that he was out there giving people cheap products. And I think, and it's laughable. The book, in the book Titan, there's a there's whole sections in which the author is just being very moralizing about how um, uh, uh, Rockefeller is doing evil things, and and he made sure to keep the prices of his kerosene lows to avoid criticism. This is the small little detail. While he was out there evil and exploiting people, he tricked people by giving them the thing that made their life infinitely better at an infinitely lower cost than they could afford it, just so that they would think that he's a good person, when in fact he was out there to get rich. And he makes it sound like he's such an evil person. And I came out of the book really sympathetic to Rockefeller. I thought he was. I thought I would see something critical. I kept looking for the evil part, and I couldn't find it. Now, granted, a lot of people have misgivings about Rockefeller's charity work, his foundations, the things that his foundations have done with modern medicine. But I don't have strong opinions on that, because I'm not quite clear on how strong his own personal role in that was. He was already mostly retired at that point and focusing on his golf. But when you look at Rockefeller, the businessman, putting aside his charity work, whatever you think of it, which for me, the jury's out on that. But as a businessman, I mean, the guy is one of the greatest humans to ever live, I think. I don't think you could fault him. And he was a truly moral person, truly cared for the poor. He gave to charity so much. And he genuinely understood that giving people cheap products was the way in which he's contributing to society. And it's just something that flies over the head of all of well, not all, but a lot of the moderns who think of him as being evil.
Yeah, that's, you mentioned the word standard, how he standardized all these things. It was, the name of the company was Standard Oil Company. And he was rewarded for all of this by the government suing his company under the antitrust law and breaking it up. They broke up his company, even though there was no evidence whatsoever that he harmed any consumers. It's another example of the mainstream of the economics profession being propagandists for statism. When the American Economic Association was founded in 1887, their founding document condemned laissez-faire, as they called it, unsound in practice and unsafe in morals. And they came up with this theory of predatory pricing, claiming that Rockefeller and people like him, yes, they dropped prices of their products for 30 years. Rockefeller did 30 years, price cut after price cut after price cut, because they're hoping that someday they will drive everybody else from the market, and then look out, monopoly. So they'll lose money on purpose on every sale for 30 or 40 years, and then become a monopoly. That's the theory that was used to justify the antitrust lawsuit against John D. Rockefeller. And it broke his company up into Standard Oil of Ohio, Standard Oil of New Jersey. And he was punished for it, just like James J. Hill was punished by the state for embarrassing the government subsidized railroads. And Rockefeller, I don't think he had much to do with the Rockefeller Foundation. There's a lot of examples of these foundations that are taken over by the left. My good friend Tom Woods says, I can paraphrase him, he said, no good deed done by a free market entrepreneur ever goes unpunished. And eventually,
Absolutely.
when Walmart came about and got into the grocery business in America, and they started underpricing the unionized grocery stores with cheap groceries, they were attacked for 20 years by the unions and the media. as being evil, not as evil as Rockefeller, but yeah, cheap groceries, we can't have that. And it's sort of the same story over and over again, isn't it?
Yeah, I should just make one small correction. I said that the Titan book on Rockefeller was written by Walter Isaacson. That was wrong. It's actually written by Ron Chernow. Uh,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
but
Ron
yeah, no,
Chernow, he's another socialist propagandist. He wrote a big book also on Alexander Hamilton, and one of my books is called Hamilton's Curse. I'm not a Hamilton fan, but there are things in that book too that he praises Hamilton for being an abolitionist because he made some nice talk about anti-slavery talk. But then in one passage of the book, he describes how Hamilton himself once purchased slaves. He went to a slave auction and purchased slaves. And so, how can you be anti slavery and purchase slaves at the same time? So, when you read these biographies of famous people by people like Ron Chernow, you have to be careful. It's kind of like reading a Bill Clinton speech.
yeah, I think that's a good metaphor. It is, and but I think if you're aware of these biases, if you've been inoculated by reading some Rothbard earlier, then it's actually quite illuminating to read this leftist take on Rockefeller or other luminaries, because
Yeah.
you can see where the propaganda uh, has to be jackhammered in to the
Sure,
story.
yeah, the famous book, The Jungle, about the meatpacking business. That was another miracle of the Industrial Revolution. How they were able to package frozen beef, ship it all over the country, and people could buy beef much cheaper than the local monopoly butcher was selling it to them. And so of course, they had to be demonized.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, so sorry, we lost you again for some reason. The last
No.
thing we got was people could buy beef much cheaper.
Yes, and so the beef trust, as it was called, had to be demonized because they provided cheap cheap meat to people all over America. The same with the Rockefeller story.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And reading the the Rockefeller story, I mean, look, the workers were very happy. They were getting paid better than other companies. The shareholders were very happy. A lot of people got rich by owning Standard Oil stock, and the customers, most importantly, were very happy. And the only people that were really upset were generally the competitors, the people who lost out because they weren't as good as him. And I think the most famous of the people who attacked Rockefeller was, I think her name was Ada Lovelace. She was a journalist who kept attacking him at that time.
Ida Tarbell.
Ida Tarbell, yes, Ida
Ida
Tarbell.
Tarbell, yes.
And she happened to be the daughter or the sister of a major oil producer who went out of business and was bought out by Rockefeller because he was just much better. So
Yeah,
it's a very small, very loud minority of people that are presenting their own grievances with somebody who was just more successful than them, as if
yeah.
it is a damning indictment of this person, and completely dismissing all of the customers, shareholders, and workers who benefited from this.
Yeah, Ida Tarbell, in her book, it's called Cutting to Kill, was a chapter of a book on the Standard Oil Company. Cutting to kill, price cutting. You're offering people cheaper, valuable products. That's killing them. But she admitted that she called it a marvelous example of efficiency in the whole Rockefeller operation, and she even praised his brother, who was apparently a business genius. And a lot of the things that are taught in MBA schools today in accounting and finance and things were adopted by the Rockefeller organization or invented by the Rockefeller organization. And despite calling him his operation a marvelous example of efficiency, she condemned it all because, as you said, I think it was her brother, the Pure Oil Company, was put out of business or bought out by Rockefeller because they just couldn't compete. They couldn't compete on cost and everything else.
Yep. And it was a similar story with the steel industry, right?
Yeah, the steel was like that. There are many examples like that. A sort of an entertaining example was Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad baron, as he was called. He got his start in business. He was hired by a man to run a ferry boat down the Hudson River outside of New York City. and he decided to charge zero. The price of getting on the ferry was zero, and he made his money by selling food and drinks on the ferry boat. And it was illegal because the other companies had a government monopoly on the ferry boat service, kind of like the public utility monopoly. And he had the police chasing him up and down the Hudson River. And the police finally gave up, and he broke up the monopoly, the government monopoly there. And then, he later on in his life, he became a railroad entrepreneur, and, and underpriced his competitors in that business too for quite a
Yeah.
while.
Yeah, so many examples. I think the term robber baron is a great example of a psyop. I think it's
Yeah,
if you see anybody referring to somebody as a robber baron, then it's generally likely that
yeah.
person is a victim of a psyop
Yeah,
because
Barron is sort of a European elitist or something like that. But James J. Hill, who I mentioned earlier, was anything but a baron. Like I said, he was orphaned. His father died when he was 9 years old. He had to raise his siblings. He went to work at 9 years old, making pennies to support his family. And he worked diligently. He was a very brilliant man. And his whole life, even when he was running this big railroad, the Great Northern, if there was some reason why someone got hurt or couldn't finish the job, he would actually pick up a shovel and help the guys on the line making the railroad beds if he was around. And that's the kind of person he was. He was hardly a baron, and he didn't rob anybody. He didn't rob anybody. He get like Rockefeller. He gave them great products at lower prices than anyone else could charge at the time.
yeah, and of course the same people who tell you about all these evil capitalists out there giving people cheap trains and cheap ferries and cheap kerosene, they don't seem to have much bad to say about the actual criminal monopolies out there, like the Federal Reserve and the people who established that.
Yeah,
So those people don't count as robber barons for some reason.
yeah.
They're barely mentioned in that same vein.
Yeah, well, Murray Rothbard, you mentioned his book, The Progressive Era, and he discusses in that book and in many other places how an essential part of the cement of statism is the state always has to have paid intellectuals to justify what they're doing. And that's always been a part of it. They can't use violence and coercion all the time because that's going to be a threat to the state because there might be a reaction. There might be a blowback by the public if they use too much violence. It's easier to brainwash people sometimes, especially when you control the government schools. And so that's another example of a reason of why we see this. There's always a core of not necessarily academics, but journalists, and newspaper owners, and people who are connected and who profit in some way from their association with the state. And that's where all of this comes from.
Yeah, and that's it's. I think it's very telling that the entrepreneur who builds something that's actually useful that helps the lives of million is vilified as a robber baron. The
Yeah,
banking cartel that is protected by the government, the Federal Reserve, is completely immune to criticism. It's a government institution.
yeah,
It's run with the best of intentions. All of these people are just out there. They're not giving people cheap services. They're not making people's lives better. They're doing the government thing of continuing to rob people and monopolizing the industry
yeah.
at their
Because
expense.
the Fed was created during the same era that all these other monopolies, the public utility monopolies, the Civil Aeronautics Board that monopolized airlines, the Interstate Commerce Commission monopolized the railroad industry because the first president, the first head of it was a railroad industry president, and they made it illegal to compete there. And that was the political aura era that existed at the time the Fed was created. It was just another government cartel operation because the banks wanted to inflate their currency, and if you don't have gold or silver in reserve in sufficient amounts, you could be in trouble. And that, of course, puts a block on the ability of banks to inflate, which is why they didn't want it. But if they could all inflate at the same time and then have a lender of last resort, which is a sort of another word of saying we will bail you out if you make too many bad loans, well, then you're basically just another government-run cartel for the banking industry. They got theirs, the railroad industry got theirs, the trucking industry got theirs with the ICC, the airline industry got theirs with the Civil Aeronautics Board, and the banking industry got their government-run cartel operation with the Fed.
Absolutely. And that's rarely ever criticized, rarely ever problematized, to use a favorite word of the leftist court intellectuals. You'll spend forever problematizing people who serve people voluntarily on the market, but government monopolies are beyond reproach usually.
Yeah, when Thomas Jefferson had a debate with Alexander Hamilton over the constitutionality of a national bank run by politicians, that is, they're debating the Bank of the United States, which was a precursor to the Fed. Jefferson looked at Hamilton's case for a bank, and he concluded that it was intentionally confusing and obfuscating because they only wanted the insiders to really know what was going on, how this whole system would work. At the same time, and I think old Thomas Jefferson was right on the money with that. And there's an economist named Larry White. He's an Austrian school economist. He taught at George Mason University for many years. He published an article in an academic journal where he surveyed the monetary journals in the academic world, like the Journal of Monetary Economics and a bunch of others. And he concluded that about 75% of all the academic journal articles published on monetary policy were published by people associated with the Fed in some way, meaning paid by the Fed in some way. And even some of the journals themselves are actually paid for by the Fed. And, Milton Friedman once said, if you want a career as an academic monetary economist, it's a good idea not to criticize the main employer in your profession. And so we get all this propaganda from the academic world praising the Fed. I once had a senior economics major in one of my classes come to me, and I was teaching a course in American economic history. And he said, I've taken the whole curriculum. I'm going to graduate. I've taken all the monetary courses and macroeconomics courses, and I had no idea that there were criticisms of the Fed out there. And they hadn't been taught any until they got to my class. But when I was in school, 150 years ago, and I took monetary economics, we learned all about the monetarists versus the Keynesians, and there were a lot of criticisms of the Fed that I was taught even as an undergraduate, but apparently no longer at a lot of universities.
This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently. For me, this was one of my wake-up moments. I'd begun to read Austrians around 2007. And then when the financial crisis happened, having read a little bit of Hayek and maybe only a tiny bit of Rothbard at that time, but I was still inoculated enough to just notice how ridiculous it was that academic economists were just out there basically translating what Ben Bernanke and John Paulson were saying to the layman. That's their entire job. And so one day they're going on about how, the financial system is fine, everything is safe, and there's no need to bail out the banks because that would create moral hazard. And then the next day, because that's what Ben Bernanke would have said. And then the next day, Ben Bernanke says, "Yep, we had to give Goldman Sachs $80 trillion or whatever." Because otherwise, your shelves would have run out of food and you'd be all starving and rioting in the streets. And then all of these economists in unison get together and just start repeating all of that stuff on their blogs, in their classes, in their universities, on their newspaper columns. Yeah, well, we had to give Goldman Sachs $80 trillion because if we did it, then the food on your shelf would have run out. And that's what passes for academic economics these
Yeah.
days. You just repeat what power says.
Yeah. Yeah. David Stockman wrote a book called The Great Deformation. A big, I think it's a 1,000-page book. I've reviewed it for the review of a quarterly journal of Austrian economics. But he discusses this in great detail, and he shows that Goldman Sachs and some of these other companies, they were not going to go out of business. They had, a few lines of their business were in bad shape because of all the bad loans that they had in their portfolio, mortgage loans. But they were fine. They were going to go out of business. And then and what happened was they got the big bailouts. Then all the executives got their normal, 20 million, $30 million bonuses for the year. So they actually got big bonuses the year that they lost all this money. And the bonuses, of course, came from the bailout money. And Stockman writes that that's what the bailouts were all about, to make sure all the executives got their bonuses for the year, regardless of performance. And talk about moral hazard problems. That's going to. And I remember at the time, also, by the way, that there were articles by in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times arguing that the cause of the crash was the Fed was not powerful enough. I think it was John Steele Gordon, the business historian, had an article. I think it was the Wall Street Journal, and he blamed it on Ron Paul. He said Ron Paul is sort of the modern day Jefferson, and because Jefferson was a big critic of a national bank run by politicians, and there's Ron Paul out there because Ron was running for the Republican nomination at the time, and he's been on the board of the Mises Institute for 43 years, by the way, Ron Paul, and so here's John Steele Gordon in the Wall Street Journal saying it's because the Fed is not powerful enough. And then there's Henry Kaufman in the Financial Times who was writing at the time that the problem is that Alan Greenspan was an associate of Ayn Rand as a young man. Ayn Rand was in favor of laissez-faire. Therefore, the Fed is a laissez-faire institution and should be given, and it didn't have enough power. That's why we had the crash of '08. That was, the bond trader, I think is Kaufman. He must have lost a lot of money in his bonds and lost his mind over it, right, to write something so silly. But that's the sort of thing you were reading in the financial press at the time.
Well, I'm not so sure you could say he lost his mind. I think it's very smart, self-interested rationale.
Yeah.
You want the central bank to be handing out more money to you. You want to vilify people who say that the central bank shouldn't be handing out money to you. But of course, as you've written yourself, this is part of a very long tradition in the US of cronyism and government intervention in the economy. All right, let's shift to more political topics. In general, I guess I'd like to begin by asking you, what are your thoughts on historical revisionism as a term and as a field? Why do you think revisionism is important?
Well, all history that is written is revisionist history. If you look at the academic historians, they specialize in a certain thing. Like you're the top expert on Alexander Hamilton. And if you're an academic, you probably write many articles and several books on Hamilton. And why would you write another one? Well, you've discovered new things to say about Hamilton. You've revised your earlier writings, and that's what all academic historians do. They pick an area, whether it's a personality like Hamilton or a topic, the gold standard or whatever it might be, and they write article after article, book after book, because they revise their thinking. And so, when we're having a conference at the Mises Institute May 15th through 17th called Revisionist History of War, and when I wrote the fundraising letter for that, I made the argument that everybody knows that there's lie after lie after lie has been our history in getting us into wars, and so why wouldn't the state lie about what actually happened during their war? At the same time, so the history of wars has to be filled with not all lies, but certainly a lot. And so we have a blockbuster group of speakers coming here at the Mises Institute in a couple of weeks to do that. And of course and of course the state responded to this whole revisionist thing is associated with Holocaust deniers. So they want to think that we're kooks, just like the Holocaust deniers. If you're a revisionist on anything, but that's nonsense because, like I said, all history that is written is revisionist history. Why would you write another book on George Washington if you didn't have something new to say about George Washington? Why would a publisher spend the money to publish it if there was nothing new to say? You could read the old book. You can buy online for $1 if it's just a book on George Washington you wanted.
Yeah. Okay, so what are your? Let's begin chronologically. What are your thoughts on Hamilton, and how do you differ from the mainstream interpretation of his?
Well, I mentioned John Steele Gordon. He wrote a book called Hamilton's Blessing. Hamilton once said that a national debt could be a public blessing, and the reason he said that is that he wanted the government to be much bigger than what the Constitution allowed for. He condemned the Constitution as a frail and worthless fabric when it was ratified because it didn't give the government enough power, and so so that's where he stood, and he was really, and John Steele Gordon praised him for that. Hamilton's Blessing. So my book, Hamilton's Curse, takes the opposite view. And Hamilton's reason for that was that the wealthier people of the country would be the ones owning the government bonds if the government accumulated debt. Therefore, they would form a political bloc in favor of higher taxes to assure there is always enough money to pay off the interest and principal and interest on their bonds, and bigger government, more money, more taxes. So he's very Machiavellian. And the left sort of recently discovered that Hamilton was the real founding father of big government in America. That's why they have this corny play about Hamilton on Broadway. They made all this money for. They keep writing books that condemn his nemesis, Thomas Jefferson, and praising Ron Chernow wrote a big, giant Pulitzer Prize winning book on Hamilton. And it's all to support his statism. Hamilton was the inventor of the idea of implied powers of the Constitution in his debate with Jefferson over the constitutionality of a national bank. Jefferson said the Constitutional Convention considered this. They voted it down. Case closed. Hamilton responded by saying, no, you got to read between the lines. They're implied powers of the government. He was the first to pervert the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, to advocate sort of pervasive government regulation of commerce. He was a big taxer. He talked George Washington into drafting 15,000 men to put down the whiskey tax rebellion in Pennsylvania. Hamilton wanted to hang all the tax rebels. George Washington ended up pardoning them all. And he was the founding father of crony capitalism. He wanted the government subsidies for the building of roads and canals, even though private enterprise was already busy building roads and canals. He didn't get his way. He was a protectionist on trade. He was an ignoramus on the economics of trade. He said silly things like anything that is not grown in America can be imported because we can't grow bananas here. But everything else we should leave out. We should have protectionist tariffs or quotas, and not have competition from abroad. And so he was an economic statist through and through. He advocated at the Constitutional Convention a permanent president, which is another word for a king. They had just fought a revolution, a bloody revolution to get rid of a king, and he turns around and wants to be a king. And so he basically wanted to bring the rotten British mercantilist system that the revolution was fought against back to America, as long as it was controlled by people like himself and his political puppet masters in New England and Philadelphia and New York, which is what they were. And it all reminded me of the scene in this old movie, History of the World Part 2, where Mel Brooks portrays the King of France. And his laugh line is to say, it's good to be the king. Like someone delivers a pallet of gold bars to him, and he looks right into the camera and says, it's good to be the king. And that was Hamilton. Mercantilism is a rotten system if you're on the paying end. But if you're on the money receiving end, it's a pretty good gig.
Okay, I'm going to do a little bit of revisionism myself here and challenge one of the sacred foundational beliefs of the U.S. Revolution. which is, yeah, I mean, sure, you could say all kinds of bad things about the British government and the British king, but ultimately, the British Revolution was over a 3% tax on tea or 2% tax on tea. Americans today pay something like 50, 60, 70% of their income in taxes, depending on how you calculate it. And yeah, they get to vote, which, is scant consolation. But I think if you told them, would you, well, I mean, my question for you, wouldn't you prefer a king and 3% tax on tea rather than a vote and 70% tax on your income?
No, I think it was more than just the taxes. There was, they cut off trade, they regulated trade, they didn't allow the Americans to trade. They had things like the ships were built with, they used a lot of pine wood. They prohibited Americans from chopping down pine trees. They had a police policing it, soldiers policing it, to fine you or put you in jail for cutting down a pine tree, and a lot of other things like that. It wasn't just the tax like that. Although I do have a British friend who once said to a group of us Americans at a conference in Cambridge, he said, you said you Americans revolted over taxation without representation, and he said, how do you like taxation with representation now that you have it? So your point is well taken on that. That's what it has all evolved to. But who knows what it would have evolved to under if we were still British. Look at England today. England is even worse than we are in America today. We would be just like them.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Although, again, you could also say that what drove Britain's decline was also a lot of taxation and representation. I think the dangerous thing here is once you start giving representation as a function of taxation, then you start making taxation sound like a good thing. And people
Yeah,
start developing this illusion that the government is out there to help them, the government is their friend.
yeah,
And then that just helps the government grow more and more and more. I
yeah,
prefer the honesty of a king because there's a clearer aspect of us versus them. There's the royal family, and then there's us plebs.
yeah,
And I'm not under the delusion that he's taxing me so that he makes my life better. And so therefore, it's difficult for him to impose more and more taxes because people aren't cheering on their own taxation because they're not conditioned to think of government as we. Government is another family. You're not part of that family. You're not in the royal palace.
yeah.
That's them. But when people get the impression that just because you get to put a piece of paper in a ballot box, then government is we, then people become a lot more receptive to all kinds of
Yeah.
government impositions on life.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, even the study of history. When I wrote several books on Lincoln, and I wrote things like about the death of at least 50,000 Southern civilians, the bombardment of cities occupied only by civilians, and the rape, murder, and arson of Sherman and other of Lincoln's generals and things like that. People have trouble believing that because they believe, we are the government, and we were the government in that time, the 1860s, and so how could we do such a thing? I would never think of murdering women and children. And so you get people that have disbelief over the bad things, the evil things the government does, because, as you said, American school children are taught from the very beginning that we are the government. That's a big myth. And the counter to that is what we call libertarian class theory. And Murray Rothbard used to quote John C. Calhoun about this a lot. He wasn't the originator of this. It goes back into European history even later. But Calhoun wrote that in a democracy, you've got two basic classes: the taxpayers versus the net taxpayers, who pay more in taxes than they get back from government in benefits, and the net tax consumers, who get more from government than they pay in taxes. And that would be the bureaucracy, the politicians, the special interests, the welfare, warfare state recipients of largesse. And Calhoun predicted that the net tax consumers would inevitably overwhelm the net taxpayers in politics so that a paper constitution would be irrelevant. They would dream up argument after argument, which they have. By the way, it's called the Hamiltonian Constitution in law schools. Hamilton started this sort of clever, lawyerly subterfuge of the Constitution with this perversion of the Commerce Clause and the idea of implied powers. He even had a theory of subsequent powers. He said, if the government does something that is unconstitutional, the fact that it did it makes it constitutional. And we've adopted that. Every time we start bombing another country, it's just assumed that it's constitutional because we did it, even though the Constitution says you have to vote, Congress has to vote for a new war. We start wars all the time. We started a war in Ukraine, and there was no vote by Congress to start a war in Ukraine, but the Congress acts as though it is whatever it does there is constitutional because it's doing it, and that was Hamilton's theory.
This is I think very astute. This is the way things go, and it's just I think it's just the ultimate contradiction of government, which is how can you give consent to somebody to have the legitimacy to initiate violence in order to try and limit the ability of people to initiate violence.
Yeah.
It's the inherent contradiction of government that can only be resolved by anarchy, by people stopping believing in this scam, I guess.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, now moving on to the Civil War. What is your take on the Civil War, and why are you so controversial about it?
Yeah, well, it's hard in a few minutes I've written 3 books on the subject, but I tell people if you want to begin understanding why there was a Civil War, carefully read Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address. At the beginning of it, I call it his Slavery Forever speech. At the beginning of it, he starts out saying, I have no intention to disturb slavery. You can read all my past speeches. I've not changed my mind on this. And besides, it would be unconstitutional for me to do so. And then at the end of the speech, he supports a constitutional amendment that had already passed the House and the Senate and had been ratified by 5 states that would have made it prohibited the federal government from ever interfering in slavery. It was called the Corwin Amendment, named after an Ohio congressman named Thomas Corwin, but it came from Lincoln. It was Lincoln's amendment. He instructed William Seward, before he was inaugurated, he got Seward, the New York senator, to get this amendment through the Senate, which he did. And then he lied about it in his first inaugural address, and he says at the end, I haven't seen this amendment, I know nothing about it, but I'm for it. I haven't actually read it, but I'm for it. Imagine that, a lawyer saying, I haven't read this document, but I'm all for it. He says, I have no problem with making it, in his words, express and irrevocable. That is the amendment that would have prohibited the government from ever interfering with slavery. So on his day he was inaugurated, he promised the world that he had no intention to disturb slavery. But in the same speech, keep in mind that there was no income tax there. About 90% or more of all federal tax revenue came from tariffs on imports. The average tariff rate was more than double 2 days earlier, more than double the rate of federal taxation. And Lincoln says, it's my duty to collect the tariffs. And then he says, but beyond that, there will be no invasion of any state. And he also said, there needs to be no invasion or no bloodshed of any state, as long as I can collect the tariffs. So he literally threatened war and bloodshed over tax collection in the same speech that I think is the most powerful defense of slavery ever made by an American politician, because this was the president on Inauguration Day, and he already had his amendment through the Congress and on its way to the states to be ratified that would have made it impossible to do anything about slavery. So if you want to know why there was a war, that's why there was a war. It was over tax collection. And everybody knew it at the time because that's what he said. And so in the Emancipation Proclamation that occurred after the Union Army was losing the war after the first 2 years because of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and people like that, he issued this Emancipation Proclamation that didn't emancipate anybody because it only applied to rebel territory where no one could emancipate anybody. And parts of the America that were under the control of the Union Army were specifically exempted. The entire state of West Virginia was created by the Republican Party under Lincoln, and it was the last slave state to enter the Union. And it entered the Union as a slave state, and they kept all the slaves as slaves in West Virginia during the war. And they gave the Republican Party 2 more senators and more electoral votes. But they didn't free any slaves in West Virginia. And it was specifically exempted in the Emancipation Proclamation, as were all the parishes in Louisiana where the Union Army was in control at the time. Each one was listed one by one right in the document. And when I visited the Lincoln Presidential Museum in Springfield, Illinois once, they had a surprising video. They had the face of an ex-slave on a video screen, and then his words, a voiceover with his words saying, that I can paraphrase it, we heard about this Emancipation Proclamation, but we knew it was false because we weren't emancipated. Nobody freed us. It's 1863. We were still slaves. So I think the only possible purpose of that was he thought it might have incited slave rebellions, and then the soldiers would have ran home to take care of their families and slave rebellions. But that never happened. It did not incite slave rebellions. And the Europeans especially castigated and ridiculed Lincoln for this because they said things like, it promises to free slaves where they cannot free slaves, which is exactly what it did.
Yeah, I remember
2 things to look at.
Yeah, I remember when I first moved to the U.S. in 2004. I think in one of my first years there, maybe in 2005 or so, I was just reading on the internet something about Lincoln, and I came across the Lincoln Douglas debate, and I came across some excerpts from there, and it's actually quite startling how very clear Lincoln was about the fact that he's not opposed to slavery, and that his problem was essentially a protectionist problem. He was worried about he wanted slaves to be sent back to Africa. He didn't want to abolish slavery because he wanted them sent back, and he thought the problem was slave labor was going to compete with white labor and drive down white wages. Right?
Yes. Yeah. Whenever he gave a speech about the Republican Party only ever opposed the extension of slavery into the new territories that were parts of the United States that were called territories that eventually became state. So you had the Kansas Territory or the Oklahoma Territory before it was the state of Oklahoma or the state of Kansas. And they said, well, we're against that. We're against allowing slaves to be brought there for 2 reasons. One, they will compete for jobs of free white labor. And those are the only people who had the right to vote were adult white males. Women didn't have the right to vote at that time, and certainly Black people, free or slave, didn't have the right to vote at that time in American history. And secondly, there was something in the Constitution called the 3/5 clause. When they decide how many members of Congress each state gets, it's based on population. So the bigger the population, the more members of Congress you get from your state. And there was the 3/5 clause said for every 5 slaves, we will count in the census as 3 people. And so you would add the number of votes of the Democrat Party if the Democrat Party which dominated the South brought slaves into the new territories that became states. And so they gave a political reason and an economic reason, but not a moral reason for opposing the extension of slavery, but never Southern slavery. The Republican platform of 1860 protected Southern slavery. It explicitly says we have no intention of disturbing the domestic institutions of the states, by which they meant slavery. Lincoln was a Hamiltonian on economics. When he first got into politics in 1832, he said, here's why I'm in politics. I want a central bank, I want protectionist tariffs, and I want internal improvement subsidies, which today we would call corporate welfare. And that's it. That's it. And he stuck with that his whole career. And that's another reason why I got interested in writing a book on Lincoln. Here's a man who said that those 3 things, economic policy, interventionist economics, was why he got into politics. He spent 25 years fighting for those things. And I'm supposed to believe that that had nothing whatsoever to do with why he was elected president or what he's doing as president. That's what Americans are taught, and it made no sense at all to me, and because it is nonsensical. And sure enough, he gets elected president. One of the first things he does, the war has already started in June of 1861. He calls Congress back to Washington, D.C. to do what? To get the ball rolling on the Pacific Railway bill to start subsidizing transcontinental railroads. Lincoln was a railroad attorney. He was a general counsel of the Illinois Central Railroad, one of the biggest corporations on the planet at the time. He rode around the Midwest in a private rail car with an entourage of Illinois Central executives. He lived in the biggest house of what's called Old Aristocracy Row in Springfield, Illinois, today. And that's who he was. He was a wealthy railroad lobbyist attorney, and that was his priority. He was also a protectionist, so the steel industry especially was behind him, and that's why he signed 10 tariff increasing bills as president. And the average tariff rate during the Lincoln regime went from a modest 15%, 1.5, to 60%, and stayed there for the next 50 years. And so that was the policy of the Republican Party, protectionism, and Lincoln, and nothing else. And of course, the corporate welfare. And he didn't get a national bank, but they did have the National Currency Acts and the Legal Tender Acts that created the greenback dollar as monopoly money. And these laws imposed taxes on competing currencies, and they taxed the competing currencies out of business. And one of them was called the Dix, which is 10 in French, DIX. And there was a bank in New Orleans that had very high ratio of gold reserves behind the Dix, $10 currency. And it was very popular and so widely used that even in the state of Minnesota, 1,000 miles north of New Orleans, it was used as currency because people trusted it. It was backed by gold. And that's where the word Dixie comes from. Merchants would come down the Mississippi River from the upper Midwest, and they would sell their wheat or whatever they're selling, and they would go home with a pocket full of Dixies, they would say. And so the South became known as the land of Dixie because of this competing currency. But that was taxed out of business by Lincoln's National Currency Acts. And he didn't get his central bank. He was a career-long advocate of bringing back the Bank of the United States. Americans abolished 3 central banks. First one was called the Bank of North America. It lasted a year and a half, and it was abolished because nobody trusted the money. It wasn't backed by anything. Then they had the Bank of the United States was given a 20-year charter. It was ended because it corrupted politics, created boom and bust cycles, price inflation. They brought it back to monetize the debt for the War of 1812, Second Bank of the United States. President Andrew Jackson abolished that one by vetoing the recharter because it did the same thing: boom and bust, price inflation, corrupted politics. So we have in American history, we have 3 examples of abolishing central banks, and there's no reason why the one we got now can't be abolished, or at the very least, change the law so that they can no longer monetize the debt by buying short-term government bonds. I think Argentina.
We're working on it. We're working on it with Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think Milei and Argentina proposed making it illegal for anyone to do that. Whether they will do that, who knows? But that's something that can be done. That didn't come along until the 1930s in the U.S. The Fed was created in 1913, but they changed the law in the 1930s to allow the government to monetize the debt in that way, and that law can be rescinded. You can still keep the Fed, but that would go a great way toward taming the Fed.
So I was familiar with the 3 banks that came after the independence, but you mentioned the first one, which is Bank of North America.
Bank of North America. You can read all about it in Murray Rothbard's History of Banking in the United States. It's online on Mises.org on our website. And the Bank of North America was the first one. The second one.
What year it was?
I forget the exact year, but I think 1781 was the first Bank of the United States, and this was before that.
Yeah.
So
I thought that was the first one.
1791, I think, rather 1791.
Oh, okay, I'll look it up.
That was the first one. You read Murray Rothbard's book, History of Money and Banking in the United States. It's online on Mises.org. It's on it goes chronologically, so you can find it very easily. And then the second was Bank of the United States, which Hamilton championed.
Yeah,
and that was
Jefferson allowed to. I think it was Jefferson who didn't renew its charter.
No, the Congress did not renew its charter.
Okay.
In 18, that would have been 1811, I think. And they brought it back. They created the second Bank of the United States because the War of 1812 came. And in 1816, they created what's called the Second Bank of the United States. And then and it had a 20-year charter also. So you get to the 1830s, and President Andrew Jackson vetoed the recharter. They wanted to give it another 20-year charter, and Andrew Jackson vetoed it, and the veto was upheld. And so it eventually, over the next several years, went out of business.
Yeah, so the first one was 1791 to 1811.
Yeah.
And then the successor was the one that, the second one was 1816 to 1936.
Yeah.
But Jackson famously said, that will kill the bank, even if it kills me. And he was right on both counts, it seems.
Yeah, that was back in the day when the so-called Supreme Court did not have a monopoly on constitutional interpretation. The Chief Justice was John Marshall, and he decreed that the Bank of the United States was constitutional, even though the Constitutional Convention took an up and down vote and voted down on that very thing. But he's a lawyer, and so lawyers, specialize in subterfuge with the language, and especially government lawyers, with lifetime tenure. They can say whatever they want and have no repercussion. And so he did that. But Andrew Jackson basically said, "Thanks for your opinion, but I'm the president, and my opinion is just as valid as your opinion." And I think somewhere along the line, he also said, "I have the army to enforce my opinion. What have you got?" And so back in those days, we didn't look at these black robe deities in the way we do today, always sitting on the edge of our chairs, waiting what the Supreme Court is going to say about my freedom. And the Jeffersonians, by the way, always said that the day ever came where everyone's freedom is in the hands of 5 government lawyers with lifetime tenure, the majority of the Supreme Court, then Americans would live under a tyranny. And that's been true ever since the end of the Civil War. That was not true before the Civil War. We had judicial review, but it wasn't the only judicial review.
Okay.
Congress had an equal say, the president had an equal say, and the people of the states were thought to have an equal say on these matters.
Yeah. I think there's a general feeling that people look at this and they think, well, it's inefficient. Well, then how is the government going to get anything done? And I think that misses the point that the whole point is for government not to get stuff done.
That's the whole point of the Constitution, is to make it hard for a government to get things done. Yeah.
Exactly. The easier it is for them to get things done, the more catastrophes.
Yeah, James Madison wrote in the famous Federalist essay number 10, he called democracy the violence of faction. Today we would call it special interest politics. And he said the whole purpose of the Constitution is to control the violence of faction in the democracy, in other words. And there's always been that tug of war. And so by the end of the 19th century, though, the democracy worshippers got their way. The movement for democracy led to we got the Fed and the income tax in 1913, but also the direct election of United States senators, the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. Previous to that, senators were appointed by legislatures. So if they said one thing back home in their state, I promise to do this, and then they go to Washington and get bribed by some lobbyist to do the opposite, they could have been fired on the spot by their state legislature. And that happened when Andrew Jackson vetoed the Bank of the United States. There were 7 senators who promised to support Andrew Jackson in his battle against the Bank of the United States. They went to Washington and they were bribed with campaign contributions and God knows what else, and voted against Jackson. And they were all recalled on the spot and lost their jobs and were replaced by somebody else. But then once we had direct election of senators, then, well, if he's in year one and he votes the opposite of what the people back home send him there for, he has 5.5 years to collect campaign contributions from all over the world to guarantee he's going to be reelected no matter what he votes on. And that's what democracy did to representation. It was another whittling down of the power of the people to control their own government.
Yeah. So, going back to the Civil War in particular, what is your perspective on the issue of slavery, and how do you think a free society would have dealt with slavery without the sort of, at least, conventional wisdom idea that Lincoln had to fight a war to stop it?
Well, you have to understand that no other country in the world had a war to end slavery. There were slaves, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Danes, the Swedes, they all had slaves. There were more slaves in the southern hemisphere than the northern hemisphere than there were in the United States by a large margin, orders of magnitude as far as that goes. And there's a book called Greatest Emancipations by Jim Powell, who catalogs how all the countries of the world ended slavery peacefully, including all the northern states. There were slaves in all. Slaves built the slave ships in New York, Boston, and Providence Harbor. They sailed to Africa, to the coast of Africa. They had house slaves Alexander Hamilton in New York City had house slaves. There are slaves in every state. There are slaves in Illinois, Pennsylvania. They all figured out a way to end slavery peacefully, as did all these other countries. The British, there was no war in Great Britain over slavery, or France or Spain or anywhere else. It was only Lincoln, only the Lincoln regime. And of course, only the second half of the war was slavery said to have anything to do with it. And so Lincoln could have done what the British did. If he really wanted to end slavery, the British bought the slaves from the slave owners and then ended it legally. And that was the only other. Slavery did not benefit the average hillbilly who fought for the Confederate Army, who did not own slaves. In fact, slavery, as Lincoln understood, slave labor competed with free labor. And the Republican Party's position was, we're against slavery in the territories because we want the votes of free white labor. Lincoln himself even used those exact words. We want the territories to be the exclusive province of free white labor. That's what Abraham Lincoln said. The same is true in the South. They didn't say that in the South, but it was true that free white labor competed with slave labor. And if you're a yeoman farmer with a small farm but no slaves, and you had to compete with the big slave plantation, that was not good for you as a businessman either. And so the vast majority of the Confederate soldiers did not own slaves, and they did not think they were fighting for slavery. They would have been a natural political constituency for ending slavery, because the whole Southern society was harmed by slavery, because slave labor is inherently less efficient than free labor. If you're a slave, you have very little incentive to accumulate skills and everything, because there's nothing in it for you. You don't get paid anymore for all of that effort you put into that, or to work hard, to work overtime and all that. That's why they had to use coercion for slaves. And so he could have done what the British did, and what all the rest of the world did. He could have done what Pennsylvania did. In New York, there's a book called Slavery in New York, and the New York Historical Society had a big exhibit once, and I was there. I went to it, called Slavery in New York. There were slaves in New York City until 1853, the eve of the Civil War. And it was only Lincoln that used violence. I think why they got more and more violent as the war went on, because they had always waged war on Southern civilians from the very beginning. And at that point, tens of thousands of civilians had been killed, and there had been massive theft and plundering of Southern property by soldiers. and hundreds of thousands of soldiers had died, and even more had been maimed. And so they couldn't say that this was all about money, which it was. Lincoln said that very clearly in his first inaugural address. So they had to think of something. And also, it got more violent because Sherman and Grant and Lincoln knew that they could be hanged if the Confederates won. They could be hanged for war crimes if the Confederates actually won the war. I even quote a Sherman biographer named John Marszalek as saying, had the Confederates won, he says they would have been justified in hanging Grant, Sherman, and Lincoln and the entire Union High Command for waging war crimes, which they did against Southern civilians during the war. And I think that's why they got even more violent, especially against the civilians in the last 2 years of the war, because they knew that could happen to them if they didn't win the war.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think in my book, Principles of Economics, I make the case for why I think what really ended slavery all over the world was industrialization. By increasing the productivity of workers, it just made it not feasible to have slave
Yeah.
labor. You don't see industrial slave labor. If
Yeah.
it's a factory, then the worker has very high productivity, and you need him to pay attention. You need him to not mess up the machine. You need him to be focused and dedicated, and that just doesn't work if you're.
He needs to read. He needs to be able to read.
Yeah.
And as far as that goes, yeah, that's why the New England and New York, they ended slavery earlier, but the way they usually ended it was in New York, for example, in the 18 as long or before the 1800s even, they passed a law saying that the children of existing slaves will be free upon reaching age 25. And so you had decades more of slavery, even though this law had been passed. And then when the child grew up and was 24, he would be sold into slavery somewhere else, Brazil, southern states. So they ended slavery, but they did not free very many slaves because they did not want the black slaves living among them in the North. The North, even Tocqueville in his famous book, Democracy in America, published in the 1830s, he said, the problem of race, he said, is worse in the North than the South. It was even worse. And so the people who ended slavery for economic reasons in the North did not free very many slaves. They ended slavery, but they sold the slaves upon reaching age 23 or 24 or whatever it was, and to somebody else, and got rid of them. And there's a book by Joanna Pope Mellish called Disowning Slavery. That's also about this, what happened in the North. And they even dug up black graves because they didn't want black people being buried alongside white people. That was the race situation in the northern states. And I grew up in Pennsylvania, and so this whole idea that Northerners were so benighted and so humanitarian that they would be willing to die by the hundreds of thousands for black strangers in Mississippi always struck me as a big pile of horse manure. But that's what every American school child is taught.
Yeah, I find it quite difficult to believe once you've considered the alternative explanations presented by people like you. It's very obviously not the case. Um, one issue that keeps coming up now, I'm curious about your opinion on this. A lot of people say Donald Trump's tariffs are a great idea because in the 19th century, the U.S. became a superpower and got really rich because of tariffs. How do
Yeah.
you answer that?
Well, that was the Industrial Revolution. We've talked about the robber barons and all that. I think they have the causation backwards. We industrialized and became prosperous, and then we adopted tariffs because a few plutocrats wanted to be protected from competition. As far as that goes, that started during the Civil War, by the way. And foreign trade was a small percentage of GDP all throughout that time. So it couldn't have been the driving force. The driving force was free market entrepreneurship by people like James J. Hill and John D. Rockefeller. And a lot of the tariffs have always been on inputs into the production process. It's just laughable that President Trump today, for example, wants higher tariffs on steel and aluminum, and then at the same time he has auto workers all cheering him. Yeah. But it's going to make the production of American cars more expensive. It'll make American cars less competitive on international markets if the cost of their steel and aluminum goes up. And that was true in spades. I'll give you one example: the McKinley Tariff of 1890. William McKinley, who later became president, was a member of Congress at the time. He's Trump's hero. President Trump has made speeches praising McKinley. He wants to be like McKinley. McKinley was also an imperialist who launched, I think, 7 or 8 invasions of Dominican Republic and Haiti and Mexico several times. A big imperialist as well. But they put his name on this tariff, even though because he was the most rabid protectionist in Congress at the time, 1890. And it was such a bad idea. And it increased the price of things that were used very widely by Americans, that the Republican Party, which had controlled the House of Representatives, was kicked out. They had a 3-to-1 minority. They were in the minority. The Democrats had a 3-to-1 majority. And McKinley himself was voted out of office because the people were so harmed. At the time, tin plate was used to manufacture a lot of things. And so there's a big increase in the price of tin. And so a lot of common household products that are made of tin skyrocketed in price. And that's just one thing. There were dozens of other things. And people equated those price increases with McKinley and the Republicans. And it almost totally destroyed the Republican Party. And so, and as I said, a lot of the inputs, it made America less competitive. If you want your industry to be strong, you want it to be subjected to competition. If you want it to become fat and lazy and uncompetitive, like the American car companies were in the 1970s, then protect them from competition like they were in the 1960s and the 1950s with tariffs and quotas and things like that.
Yeah, and I think I think what's also missed here, as you said, the size of foreign trade was a very much smaller part of the economy, and I think what's missed here is that the U.S. itself was always one giant free trade zone where people could trade within that zone without any tariffs. And I think this is arguably one of the most important reasons for the US's economic development. It had always been the world's largest free market, maybe until recently. China now is possibly bigger by some metrics, but it was always the largest market. And you've got 50 states, and if you can make one thing in one of those states, then you can sell it in all 50 states. And it's a huge geographic area with a lot of production.
Yeah.
So to credit the tariffs on the foreign goods, which was a small part of the economy, I think is wrong. But I think the other aspect of it is that even if the tariffs were high, the total burden on the citizens of tariffs and taxes and inflation was a lot lower than it is today.
Oh, sure.
Key point.
Oh, sure. Today, I think I used to look up once in a while national income, get the government statistics on national income, and then get the government statistics on all taxes, federal, state, and local, and divide the two, taxes divided by national income. And you would usually get 33%, 35, 38%. And then if you consider that regulation is an implicit tax because it pushes up the price of whatever is being regulated, then you can easily say that we pay at least 50% of everybody's income in tax. The National Taxpayers Union every day celebrates Tax Freedom Day. It's usually right around now. It's usually like April 15th. Today is tax day, but it's also Tax Freedom Day because they get this number, taxes divided by income, and say the average American works for about 3.5 months out of every year just to pay taxes. And that's sort of deceiving because the top 50% of income earners, which is only adjusted gross income of about $50,000 a year or more, pay 98% of all taxes. The bottom 50% pay almost no income tax. And so you've got that top 50% paying everything. And that's sort of Calhoun, John C. Calhoun would be that'd be a nightmare to him because you talk about the net taxpayers. or this upper group, and the net tax consumer is half the country now, more than half the country.
Yeah. Okay. Generally, what thinkers outside of the Austrian school would you recommend for people interested in learning more about history and economics in general? What are some of the important scholars other than Rothbard, Mises, Hayek, and the ones that
Yeah.
we're very familiar with?
Well, I'll mention another friend of ours, Ralph Rako. He's a historian. We just published a book of his essays on the history of liberty. He wrote his doctoral dissertation under Friedrich Hayek at the University of Chicago on the history of liberty in Europe, the European tradition. And we took all his speeches, his videos of speeches, and had them transcribed into this new book that we just published a couple of weeks ago. He also published a book called The World at War. And of course, I'm an economist. I read a lot of the Chicago School economists over the years. I got interested in economics by Milton Friedman when I was a college student, read his popular writings. James Buchanan was a professor of mine in graduate school. He won the Nobel Prize in economics for basically creating the public choice school of economics, which is the economic analysis of political decision making. There's a big literature on the economics of bureaucracy there. And another historian, there's one of my favorites, is Clyde Wilson. He's an American history. He was taught history at the University of South Carolina for many years. He's one of the most learned men I've known I knew in my 41-year career as an academic. And I always read anything I see I find by Clyde Wilson. That's another person whose work I value out there. And the whole the whole literature on decentralization. We tend to think, especially in America, left and right. Either Milei is going to be the president of Argentina, or another socialist Peronist is going to be the president of Argentina. But you can also think vertically about politics, how to decentralize power so it doesn't matter as much who the president is. It might matter more who the county sheriff is. And my friends at the Abbeville Institute have written for 20 years now a lot of great articles and books on the whole idea of federalism and states' rights. And the Swiss and the Americans are famous for the system of federalism. I think the Swiss have kept the roots of their federalism more than Americans have. We've destroyed most of it in this country, and the Swiss are on their way to destroying their system of federalism, I think. Hopefully they'll reverse it. But the Abbeville Institute tries to keep that tradition alive. And there's a lot of great literature on the sort of the Jeffersonian decentralist tradition in American political thought. And if you peruse their website, you get a lot of great literature.
Excellent. Well, now good transition to talking about my favorite website, Mises.org, and the Mises Institute in general. So you've been president of the Mises Institute now for, I think, a couple of years, right?
About a year and a half. Yeah.
Year and a half, yeah.
Yeah.
So what's new in the Mises Institute, and what are your plans for the future, and what is your vision for what you want to achieve?
Well, we want to keep promoting the Misesian and Rothbardian tradition of scholarship. We have our next conference is on revisionist history of war. That's May 15th through 17th. Next year would have been Murray Rothbard's 100th birthday. So it's going to be the year of Rothbard at the Mises Institute. Our big May conference, which we have every year on some topic, will be on the Rothbardian tradition of liberty and economics. And we haven't worked out the speakers and things like that, but it'll be a conference and a book, just like our revisionist history of war conference. We will produce a book by all the speakers at that conference. And so those are a couple of the things that we're doing at the Mises Institute. We produced a video called Playing with Fire about the Fed, and it came out in October. And we now have, as of yesterday, about 920,000 views on YouTube of our 38-minute documentary about the Fed. And the title came from Jim Grant. He's a place that the Fed is like an arsonist who starts a fire. And then once the fire is raging, he changes clothes into a firefighter's outfit and tries to put out the fire by putting more gasoline on it. and that's why Playing with Fire is the main title of our documentary. And we have new podcasts to reach the younger people primarily at the Mises Institute. So check out our website. We still have books like Man, Economy, and State by Murray Rothbard. They're downloaded off our site 30 to 40,000 times a month, every month, year in and year out, along with Human Action by Ludwig von Mises, 30, 40, 50,000 downloads a month, every month. And so you can get a great free education on our website. And we work very hard at it. And we have about 5 million unique viewers every year of Mises.org.
Yeah, I cannot thank you and the Institute enough. It was absolutely monumental for my intellectual journey and for my life in general. I came across the website, I think, in 2007 for the first time, and just finding all these books and digging in and reading was just absolutely amazing. It's incredible that you put all of this material out there for free. It makes it great for anybody to get access to this incredible.
Yes, we had a donor that gave us enough money to give away 100,000 copies of Murray Rothbard's book, What Has Government Done to Our Money? And we still have a few left. So if any of your viewers would like a free copy of What Has Government Done to Our Money, they can get on our website and sign up. We also gave away 100,000 copies of Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And then a different donor saw this and gave us enough money. We just put together a new book of essays by Friedrich Hayek called Hayek. We're calling it Hayek for the 21st Century, Essays in Political Economy. And in about a month, you'll be able to get on Mises.org and get your free copy of that book also.
Fantastic. Excellent. Anything else you want to share with us about the Institute or your own work? Any new updates?
New updates? No, just I think I encourage everybody to get our free books and educate themselves. You don't need a degree in economics to understand economics. And we have Mises University is our sort of main program. We usually get about 120 college students from all over the world every summer come to Alabama in July to listen to economics lectures for no college credit. And these are very unique young people, and they're very motivated, and we're capitalists. And so we have an optional contest at the end, an exam, and the first place winner gets $2,500, the second place $1,500, the third place $500, and it's very competitive. And some years we'll get a brilliant high school student who will win the first prize or second prize, even though he or she is competing against PhD students. We always have mostly undergraduates with some PhD students, and we get 2 or 3 or 4 very bright high school students every year also. And so if you have any young people who are interested in learning about free market Austrian school economics, send them to our Mises University.
Yeah, and moving on to current affairs, do you have thoughts on current economic policy? What are your thoughts on Trump's tariffs, for instance?
Well, I think Trump has made a big mess of things. He's increased our average tariff rate from 2.5% to about tenfold if he goes through with what he's promising. We shall see. It was kind of disturbing to me that the head of the European Union said, okay, Mr. Trump, we will go to zero tariffs if you go to zero tariffs. And he didn't respond. He didn't get back to them. And so that told me that he doesn't want zero tariffs. And he had a choice. He wants to be the great negotiator. I think he's barking up the wrong tree. I think we've had situations like South Korea for 2 years ago had zero tariffs on American imports, and we still had a trade deficit with South Korea. And Trump is basing this whole thing on trade deficits, which he blames on his predecessors who are bad negotiators, because he, of course, is the best negotiator in all time, according to him, and that's his theory. But it doesn't make sense in that regard. Even Mexico, not too long ago, Mexico had no tariffs on American imports, but we had a trade deficit with Mexico. And Trump thinks it's because we are bad negotiators. But that has to be untrue in light of those facts. And so that's why I said he's barking up the wrong tree. It's based on a false notion about what causes trade deficits. American companies are uncompetitive with a lot of these countries. our wages are maybe 10 times higher than some of these other countries. And I think that's a more important thing because our technology does not produce enough productivity to justify a tenfold increase in wages over Mexico or whoever we're trading with.
Yeah, I think the key problem here, as you said, is, some countries already had 0% tariffs, and so this idea that this is some genius 4D chess move to try and get all these other countries to drop tariffs doesn't make sense, because some countries had already offered to drop tariffs and
Yes.
they were rebuffed, and some countries
Yeah.
already had zero tariffs. So I think it really is true, as ridiculous as it sounds. He genuinely does believe that a trade deficit with any country means that that country is stealing from you, and
Yeah.
that if and that's yeah, that's because Biden was a bad negotiator and all the previous presidents were bad
Yeah.
negotiators, and that what they need is just some real estate magnate from New York who knows how to negotiate to twist these countries' arms, and then suddenly the US will have a trade surplus with all of them. But of course, the insane thing here is that the reason the US can run all of its trade deficits is because of its money printer. And that's the
Yeah.
whole point of having a money printer. If
Yeah.
you don't want the trade deficit, just get rid of the money printer, and then you won't be able to spend more than you earn.
Yeah, well, that's why if you compare American wages to some of the other countries' wages, and ours might be 5 or 6, 7 times higher, it's because of all the Fed money printing and create all the price inflation, and the workers get the cost of living raises, which doesn't benefit them because everything they buy costs more too. But it creates this situation where you might be paying $39 an hour in the United States and $6 an hour in South Korea, let's say, in a particular industry, and that makes it hard to compete. But the Fed is behind the creation of that situation.
Absolutely. And what are your thoughts on current U.S. foreign policy? Do you think the U.S. is being led to another war?
Well, they're trying. They're trying. There's a news report last week that the Secretary of Defense Hegseth talked Trump out of bombing Iran, and then immediately the next day, there's all over the internet here in the United States that there's a crusade to get rid of Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, and so yeah, we're now at war with Israel against all whoever Israel wants to be at war with, which apparently includes Syria now, and we're at war with Russia now because we are supplying arms to Ukraine, have been, and people. We can't be sending them all this military technology without also sending the people who know how to use the technology. And so we've been doing that. And Trump promised to be anti-war, but the first thing he promises is to send more armaments to Ukraine and Israel. And so he's pro-war, and it's very dangerous. And he wants to brag that he can negotiate peace in the entire planet, but at the same time, he's sending more bombs and more fighter jets to foreign countries to murder more foreigners who never threatened Americans with anything.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing just how enthusiastic he's been about all these wars, even in spite of all the rhetoric about him being a peace president and him not wanting to launch wars. But things have been progressing in that way, and then the aggressive way in which he's been supporting Israel's genocide has just been incredible. Um, the
Yeah,
the U.S.
well,
the U.S. stands to gain absolutely nothing from that. They have no interest in that part of the world whatsoever.
yeah, that's true. A wealthy Las Vegas casino owner gave him $100 million for his campaign, and so he owes her big time. And
Yeah,
that's what he's doing.
yeah, and perhaps related to that, Walter Block was recently expelled and removed from the Mises Institute because of that. Do you have any thoughts on this, and why you, as the institute, felt the need to do this?
He's no longer an unpaid senior fellow. He wasn't expelled, but he's no longer an unpaid senior fellow because he's writing articles advocating the dropping of nuclear bombs on Muslim countries and mass murdering women, children, and babies in Gaza, and cheerleading for it, very enthusiastic cheerleading, castigating American taxpayers as being too stingy and not sending enough bombs to Israel, things like that. And we told him this is inherently incompatible with our mission at the Mises Institute. And no one is stopping him from writing as much as he wants to write, but we can't be associated with someone who basically is a cheerleader for genocide. He's been bugging me to hold a debate on the topic, genocide, good or bad. And I keep telling him and some of his friends that only a nut would think it's a legitimate debate, genocide, good or bad. And so if he wants to make himself out as a nut, good luck with that, Walter Block. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
Yeah, before the current war, a couple of years ago, I had the debate with him. A couple of friends organized a debate where we discussed the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that was perhaps a transformative moment for me in my understanding for the conflict, because I thought Walter Block would be able to present the steelman case for Israel and Zionism, and I was absolutely amazed at just how completely and utterly vacuous and childish and moronic his arguments were, and that they basically boil down to nothing more than, I don't want to recognize that Palestinians can have property rights in the land of Israel because uh, all of their property rights are invalid, and therefore anything they do to defend their property rights is a criminal act, and then anything that the Israeli government does in return is justified. And it's just a completely incompatible way of thinking to anything that any Austrian would think about. But really, when it comes to this topic, it's fair to say that he just becomes a lunatic, a bloodthirsty monster.
Yes, that's
He's
exactly what it's become.
incapable. Yeah, he's incapable of understanding the idea. I mean, I was telling him, okay, what can somebody like me do? I was born not Jewish on that land, and my ancestors had lived there for centuries. So what can I do? And he has absolutely no answer for it. It's just leave
Yeah.
or die, or just Israel needs to do what it does. And it's
And
incredible.
he conflates Muslims with Arabs. He thinks it's the same thing. There are no Christian Arabs, or nothing else. And so you're right. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And yeah, he's become a bloodthirsty monster, like you say. And so, what else can you say about it? That's what I wrote him a letter when he said you can't be a senior fellow at the Mises Institute anymore if you're going to write things like this. It's fundamentally incompatible with what we believe in and what our mission statement says. End of story. And
Yeah.
we could go on and on about it. That's why one of the speakers, by the way, in our revisionist history of the war is going to be Ilana Mercer, who's a great friend of mine. And she's the daughter of an Israeli rabbi and born and raised in Israel. But there's no sharper critic of the genocide going on there than Ilana Mercer. And we're also having a survivor of the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty in
I see.
1967 to tell the story of what happened there. He's the president of the USS Liberty Veterans Association, and so we will kind of touch on this general topic in our conference.
Yeah, that's a pretty important one. It's amazing how little anybody talks about it. I mean, it's sort of like it's a century after the Civil War, but there's a lot more evidence than there are survivors, and yet people just don't even mention it in mainstream American discourse. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, it's one of those things you're not supposed to talk about.
Exactly, which is what the Mises Institute specializes in, which is why we love you guys.
Yeah, so we don't take any prisoners. We don't compromise. That was the spirit of Murray Rothbard. That's why Murray, he should have had an endowed chair at an Ivy League school his entire career. He was that brilliant. But of course, people like us don't get jobs like that.
No, absolutely. And I think you look at the kind of people who have endowed chairs in Ivy League universities, I don't think any of them has produced any book that can compare to any book written by Murray Rothbard.
Yeah. Yeah. How many of them do you think 50 years after, 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 50 years af Well, Murray died in 95, so 30 years after their death, there's 40,000 downloads a month of one of their books. None of them, not
Yeah.
one.
I don't think any of them would get 40,000 downloads
Or Alan
in a
Greenspan,
lifetime.
how many people are downloading his ranting and ravings in
Yeah,
anything he has ever written? Even though
exactly.
he was climbed to the heights of his profession, chairman of the Fed.
Yeah, this was, before the internet or in the early days of the internet, this was a common refrain amongst mainstream economists, which is, well, the Austrians don't matter because all the important jobs are held by the Keynesians, and so the Austrians don't matter. But you think about people like Paul Samuelson, all of these most important mainstream economists, even people like Milton Friedman. Rarely anybody reads their actual work today. I mean, Friedman is more famous today because of his propaganda, his movies, which are
Yes.
actually pretty good. But his scholarship, I mean, who downloads his history of the United States, monetary history of the United States that he
Yeah.
wrote? Who actually
And
reads that?
he
I
won the
did,
Nobel
but I
Nobel
weirdly,
Prize for his theory of the consumption function, and nobody reads that.
yeah, absolutely. And yet Rothbard's books, Mises' books, they get downloaded in the tens of thousands, as you said.
Yeah, you probably heard of the story of the UFC fighter Renato Moicano,
Yes.
Brazilian, and at the end of his fight, he grabs the microphone from Joe Rogan in front of 15,000 people and shouts out, "If you love your country, you will read Ludwig von Mises."
Yes.
So yeah,
Absolutely.
we immediately sent him a big box of books and invited him to speak at Mises University, and we have a T-shirt made with that saying on the back and his likeness on the back of a T-shirt in our bookstore.
Excellent. Which reminds me, my old collection of Mises Institute T-shirts is all worn out now. I need to go shopping and get my new kit of
Well, we
Mises.
have some new additions to the line, so you can go online and order some new ones.
Yes, I highly recommend and endorse Mises Institute merchandise. Beautiful T-shirts and high quality stuff.
Okay, well, thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you so much for everything you do at the Mises Institute and for all of your scholarship.
Okay, my pleasure. It was a great fun to be with you, and keep up the great work.
Thank you very much. Have a good
Okay,
day.
you too.